Most people assume grocery prices behave symmetrically. Inflation rises, prices go up. Inflation cools, prices should come back down. That expectation feels logical because it mirrors how inflation is reported. Monthly prints, year-over-year percentages, a single headline number that implies movement in both directions. By mid-2025, that logic failed in plain sight. Headline inflation slowed, cost pressures eased, public language shifted toward cooling and normalization. Yet grocery totals at checkout remained elevated. Prices stopped climbing as fast, but they did not reverse. The error sits in how inflation is interpreted. A lower CPI print measures a change in velocity, not a change in position. Prices are still moving forward. They are just accelerating more slowly. But because economic reporting uses terms that imply temperature and motion, the public anticipates reversal. That anticipation is a category error. The metric never promised prices would go backward, only that they would rise more slowly. Retail environments reinforce this misinterpretation. Promotions return, discount labels reappear, loyalty offers create visible movement on shelves. These signals suggest flexibility, even when base prices remain fixed. Temporary relief is mistaken for structural change. This leads to a common assumption that grocery prices are merely lagging, that given enough time, lower inflation will naturally translate into cheaper food. The system appears delayed, not rigid. That assumption sets the stage for the misunderstanding that follows. What looks like a pause before prices fall is not hesitation. It is the system operating on a different logic entirely. What is actually happening sits upstream from the checkout lane, long before a price tag is printed. Grocery prices are not reset continuously. They are built on contracts, cost assumptions, and margin buffers established during periods of stress. During the 2022 to 2023 inflation spike, food manufacturers renegotiated supplier agreements to reflect higher labor, packaging, transportation, and commodity costs. Retailers accepted those increases to keep shelves stocked. Those negotiations did not expire when inflation slowed. They reset the baseline. By 2025, many of the original cost pressures had eased. Freight rates normalized. Energy prices stabilized. Some commodity inputs declined from peak levels. But the structure that converts those inputs into shelf prices remained anchored to earlier contracts. Wholesale price lists did not automatically roll back. They flattened. From major distribution nodes to regional warehouses, pricing is still governed by terms set quarters earlier. Retailers receive goods at stabilized but elevated costs, then apply standard markups designed to preserve margin consistency, not to dynamically track input volatility. This is why disinflation looks like relief in reports, but not in stores. A slower rate of increase reduces future pressure. It does not undo the past reset. For grocery pricing to fall, one of two things must happen. Suppliers must cut list prices, or retailers must voluntarily compress margins. Neither is mechanically triggered by lower inflation readings. Instead, relief is redirected. Temporary promotions, loyalty discounts, and bulk offers absorb consumer pressure without altering base prices. The system satisfies demand for movement while protecting the new price floor. The result is price stickiness, not because costs are still rising sharply, but because the cost structure that justified higher prices has already been accepted and normalized. What changed was the speed of increase, not the level. This is the quiet distinction that defines the system. Inflation data describes motion. Grocery pricing reflects position. Once the position resets higher, the system does not automatically move it back. Once the higher price level is accepted, the system begins to reinforce it. Not through explicit coordination, but through a set of incentives that reward holding the line rather than reversing it. Retail pricing operates on reference points. After a shock resets shelf prices upward, those numbers become the new anchor for both retailers and consumers. Internal planning, margin targets, and performance benchmarks adjust to the higher baseline. Future decisions are evaluated relative to that level, not the pre-shock past. At the same time, competitive pressure shifts. When all major players absorb similar upstream increases, no single retailer gains advantage by cutting base prices first. A rollback would compress margins immediately, while the demand response is uncertain and temporary. Holding prices steady carries less risk than initiating a reversal. Disinflation accelerates this dynamic rather than weakening it. As input costs stabilize, urgency disappears. There is no forcing function that demands renegotiation or repricing. Suppliers prefer to preserve list prices. Retailers prefer predictable margins. The system converges on stability, not reduction. Consumer behavior adapts in parallel. Shoppers respond to higher prices by changing mix rather than resisting levels. They switch brands, buy smaller quantities, or time purchases around promotions. Volume shifts absorb pressure that might otherwise force price cuts. The signal sent upstream is adjustment, not rejection. Promotions play a critical role here. Discounts provide flexibility without altering the anchor. They create the appearance of movement while keeping the reference price intact. Over time, consumers learn to treat promotions as the relief valve and base prices as fixed. This is how the system accelerates. What began as a response to temporary inflation becomes self-reinforcing. Anchors reset. Benchmarks adjust. Risk preferences align around preservation. The longer prices remain elevated, the less plausible reversal becomes. At this stage, grocery prices are no longer reacting to inflation. They are reacting to their own history. The system is now moving forward on inertia, not pressure. By the time prices stabilize at a higher level, the exits have already narrowed. Reversal is no longer a response to easing costs. It requires coordinated disruption across incentives that are explicitly designed to resist volatility. For a meaningful rollback to occur, suppliers would need to cut list prices. Retailers would need to accept margin compression, and competitors would need to follow quickly enough to avoid signaling weakness. Each move is visible. None are rewarded. Public reporting frameworks harden this constraint. Large grocery retailers are evaluated quarter by quarter on margin stability, earnings predictability, and guidance consistency. Analysts do not penalize high prices if margins are stable. They penalize surprises. Even benevolent volatility, like proactive price cuts, creates earnings risk with no guaranteed upside. This pushes decision-making upward. Pricing is no longer just a merchandising choice. It is a financial reporting variable. Once elevated prices are embedded in revenue expectations, reversing them threatens forecasts, not just profits. Stability becomes the dominant optimization target. This is why cost normalization alone does not reopen the exit. Lower freight bills or cheaper inputs do not mechanically translate into shelf price cuts when doing so would introduce earnings variance. The system prefers a known, elevated baseline to an uncertain reset. Contracts reinforce the lock-in. Renegotiations start from the current price floor, not from historical levels. Each cycle assumes the last one as given. The shock is absorbed, then institutionalized. At this stage, grocery pricing is no longer reacting to inflation or consumers. It is reacting to capital markets. What would force prices down is not lower costs, but a shift in what the system is punished for. That shift does not arrive quietly. What makes this outcome persist is not any single decision, but how the system resolves uncertainty. After a shock, prices move up quickly because cost increases are immediate and visible. The reversal path is slower because it requires discretionary action across actors who are not rewarded for moving first. Once grocery prices reset higher, The system reclassifies them from temporary response to normal state. Contracts, forecasts, and benchmarks update around the new level. Future negotiations begin there. Planning assumptions embed it. The past stops functioning as a reference point. Disinflation does not challenge this structure. It removes urgency without creating pressure. Stabilizing costs reduce the need to renegotiate aggressively. Calm is interpreted as confirmation. The status quo becomes defensible. Capital markets complete the loop. As long as margins remain predictable and guidance holds, elevated prices are validated. There is no penalty for maintaining a higher baseline. There is risk in disturbing it. Over time, that risk aversion hardens into policy. This is why grocery prices behave asymmetrically. They rise quickly under stress and descend slowly, if at all, once the stress passes. Economists call this the ratchet effect. The system is optimized to pass shocks forward and absorb recoveries internally. The result is a permanent gap between what prices were and what they are now. Not because inflation remains high, but because the mechanisms that raised prices remain intact after the justification fades. Once a new floor is established, it stops being debated.